Okay, hello, in-person attendees and virtual attendees. We're back from a break. And to start our second and final presentation of the day, I will be introducing Kelsey Parker. And Kelsey, if you'd like to start getting your slides ready as I introduce you, you can. You should be co-host by now. So Kelsey Parker is a PhD candidate in Earth and Environmental Sciences at CUNY Graduate Center. Her advisor is Dr. Andrew Breinman at the Advanced Science Research Center. She graduated with a BS in Environmental Science in 2017, and shortly after, she received a Fulbright Fellowship to study the remediation of potential plants in an active lead and zinc mine in Kabwe, Zambia. Her current work focuses on invasive species and their interactions with a particular interest in urban forests. So thank you, Kelsey, for joining us. I see your PowerPoint screen, not yet in PowerPoint and presenter mode. And I'll check if we can hear you. Can you hear?
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yay.
Fantastic.
And we can see you. So great to meet you, and thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to come and talk about this today. So my talk today comes from a paper published with the same title. And it's really about how researchers who focus on remote sensing work can work with practitioners in the field, and how we can work together to maximize our capability to monitor invasive species using remote sensing. So first, I'm going to do introduction to remote sensing, some background, and then sort of get into what we learned as a group. So, we're a group of academic researchers. Some of us work at government organizations, nonprofits, things like that. So we really span a variety of interests and professions, and sort of what we learned through our project. So to start off, remote sensing is using imagery collected via satellite, drone, aircraft, what have you, and using that to monitor physical characteristics at the surface by using the measured reflected radiation. So this is an example of what we would call passive satellite remote sensing. So we have our satellite here, and it is measuring the amount of solar radiation that is reflected off of a surface. You can have active remote sensing where your sensor is actually emitting the radiation and measuring its reflectance. That would be active remote sensing. But basically the way that remote sensing works is different types of surfaces are going to reflect different wavelengths of light in different amounts. So if we have, let's say, water, we call this a spectral signature. So the spectral signature of water, it is going to reflect low levels of visible light only. And if we are comparing that to something like vegetation, like a forest, the spectral signature of that, it's going to reflect more near infrared and less mid-infrared light. So we can tell the difference between these two surface types based on the way that they're going to reflect this light. And anytime we are doing a project with remote sensing, there's a lot of consideration that goes into the source of the data that we're going to use. There's tons of satellites available. There's a lot of aircraft that can collect remote sensing data, drones, and each project you really have to sort of the data you're going to collect, the timeframes, all of this, the sources you're going to use are going to be really specific to your project. And there's three main resolutions that we have to think about. The first being spatial resolution. So if we have a high spatial resolution, our image is going to be a lot more clear. And we're going to be less likely to get what we call a mixed pixel. So if we go back here, if we're using a satellite that has low spatial resolution, so let's say it's like 50 meters, And this satellite is recording the reflectance. Well, 50 meters could capture this forest, this water, and this grass area all in one pixel. So when the satellite is reading the reflectance, it's not reading the reflectance of each of these three things individually. It's going to be measuring the reflectance of all three of these objects together. So we get a murky picture of what's happening because there's mixed land use types, land cover types happening within this image. Whereas if you have high spatial resolution, say like a meter, that would just be, this one forest. So the satellite is measuring the reflected radiation of this forest plus this meter plus this water all separately in different pixels. So you'll get clear pictures in each one of what is happening. So instead of having this 50 meters where we're having all three of these things represented, if we were to break this up into 50 different sections, then we'd have like 30 of them that's forest, and water and grass spread out amongst the rest of that. And it would be very clear what each thing is because each pixel is going to be reflected off one surface type. And next we have spectral resolution. So this has to do with the number or the span of wavelengths that these bands, the sensor is measuring. So like a typical basic satellite is going to measure reflectance in red, blue, green, and near infrared. So we have 4 bands. But if we have data that has higher spectral resolution, then these bands of wavelengths are going to be broken up into smaller pieces, so we can ask more specific questions. Instead of just saying, okay, so how is blue light being reflected, and having this band of wavelengths that spans 500 nanometers here, a higher spectral resolution will break this up into different pieces. So instead of saying, okay, how does it reflect blue light, we can say, how is the surface reflecting light at the specific wavelength of 600 to 700 nanometers? And we can ask much more specific questions with that. There's a lot more detail we can get from this higher spectral resolution. And then finally, we have temporal resolution. And there's really 2 pieces to this. So one is how long has this satellite, the sensor, been collecting data, how far back in time? And in terms of satellites, usually these satellites revisit the same location fairly regularly. So this can be every 2 days, every 20 days. And that can be really important based on what you're looking at, how frequently you need to collect images, but also if you're collecting like satellite data in April and it's really rainy, it's really hard to see through clouds. So having a higher temporal resolution means that we have a greater chance of getting a usable image compared to a satellite that doesn't return quite as often. You might be stuck with cloudy images for just by luck or bad luck, I suppose. You might just be stuck with cloudy images for a while because it happens that the day the satellite is coming keeps being cloudy. Like I said, there are tons of different data sources for remote sensing. 2 of the high resolution data sources are AVRIS. So AVRIS is actually an aircraft that you can pay and schedule to have flown over a very specific area at a very specific time. It is hyperspectral, so it has it spans the same length of wavelengths, so it covers the same types of emitted light, but it breaks them up into narrower bands. So we can really look at, okay, how is the surface reflecting light at 400 to 500 nanometers rather than 400 to, let's say, 1,000 nanometers that other bands might represent. So we get more specific questions. The spatial resolution is a little bit lower. It's 20 meters. That's moderate, I would say. But because this is an aircraft being flown, there's no revisit time unless you schedule to have a flight happen again later in the future, or if you're incredibly lucky and AVRIS has already been flown over your area of interest, which is fairly unlikely. And as you can imagine, this is quite expensive. And then we have worldviews. There's a couple of different worldview satellites. These have 8 bands, pretty moderate, but it has the highest spatial resolution you can find available in commercial satellites, with a pixel being between 50 centimeters and 1 meter in resolution. So that's incredibly detailed imagery, and it revisits every 2 days. So these are wonderful data sources. They can tell us a ton of information, but they're quite expensive. So for Worldview, last I checked, they were selling, some places were selling Worldview data for $10 per kilometer, which doesn't necessarily seem like a lot, but if you're trying to monitor, the Catskills, and you're paying $10 per square kilometer of imagery, and you're looking at a place that's thousands of square kilometers large, and you need images for multiple times throughout a year over multiple years, that adds up really quickly. So this data is great. It's amazing. We can get so much information out of it, but it's really at the cost, or at the cost of the cost. It takes a lot more money to be able to get this higher resolution data. But there are some free options. NASA has Landsat satellites that have been collecting imagery since the 80s. They were one of the first, so you can get data going fairly far back using Landsat. It has a 30-meter spatial resolution and passes by every 16 days. So at the lower price, or at the free, we are losing some of that resolution. So it's really a trade-off. This image, there's a lot happening here. You probably can't read most of it on that screen. But what's really important is that another option for free satellite imagery is a satellite called Sentinel. So there's 3 that have been that are operational currently, 3 that are in the process. This is from the European Space Agency, but it's free data for everyone. It's not just for European citizens. And data goes back to 2015, and the spatial resolution is 10 meters. So it has better spatial resolution. The revisit time is between 1 and 5 days, but data doesn't go as far back. So it's really difficult when you're starting off a project to try and figure out what the right data source is. And you have to really consider, a variety of factors: how much funding you have, how long do you have to build a time series of for these images, and do we want this to be easy to replicate? The great thing about these free options, besides the fact that they're free, is that there are resources such as Climate Engine, where they have this data built into the site, and you can go in. You don't need any experience with remote sensing. You could go in, you just put in the data that you're interested in, what statistics you're looking for, and your time period, and it does some cloud computing and will give you a map of the variable that you're looking for. So it's a wonderful tool. You don't need to have computers that are able to process large amounts of data, and you don't need to have a ton of background to do it, and it's all free. But again, it's at the cost of this resolution. Now, how can we use remote sensing, which is going to be referred to as RS from here now? How can we use this to monitor invasive species? There's really 2 main ways to do this. The first is measuring changes in vegetation health over time. So we can do this. The simplest way to do this is with NDVI, or Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And essentially what this does is it leverages the way that healthy versus unhealthy vegetation reflects near infrared and red light differently. So as the vegetation begins to decline, it starts to reflect more red light and slightly less near infrared light. And that means that as vegetation declines, this NDVI value will decrease. And this is particularly useful when we are looking for invasive pests and pathogens, things like Hemlock woolly Indelgid, emerald ash borer, oak wilt. These are things that a satellite is incredibly unlikely going to be able to pick up. They're too small. They're, not located the way they're located on the tree or whatever they're infesting is not something that satellites can pick up. But instead, we are monitoring the effect of these invasive species on whatever their host is. And then the second way is looking at phenology or seasonality. So in our talk before, these calorie pairs, like we talked about, they tend to leaf out earlier than native species. So you can use this satellite imagery to find invasive species by figuring out where these NDVIs are increasing earlier than the surrounding area. Now, like you said, it didn't work great for calorie pairs, but maybe this is something that hyperspectral data could get at a little bit better. An example of both of these, so if we have Hemlock woolly Indelgid, we're starting off with a healthy hemlock tree. As it goes through these various states of decline, the NDVI value of these trees, as recorded by these satellites, is also going to decline over time. And for an example of this seasonality or phenology, Weisberg et al. Have this fantastic paper where they used a type of NDVI using slightly different satellite data. And they're able to show that over time, throughout the year, their invasive cheatgrass, which is this solid gray line, began to the NDVI values between this invasive cheatgrass in the gray line and the Medusa head changed. So early in the season, the Medusa grass and cheatgrass look very similar when it comes to NDVI in satellite imagery, but through later in the year, you can really start to pick out these NDVI differences, and they were able to use this to fairly accurately locate cheatgrass just using these satellite images. Now, this paper really came together. We were through funding from the Carey Institute, Catskills Research Institute, and it was, me and my advisor as researchers with, most of our job being conducting scientific research and publishing scientific papers that go through peer review. And we were working with a group of practitioners whose main work objective was ecosystem management, monitoring, and mitigating, when possible, the effects of different invasive species. And we came together with this mutual interest in how we can monitor Hemlock woolly Indelgid using remote sensing. And we had done a lot of literature reviews and through talking to these different practitioners, it seemed like there was, from the remote sensing researcher side, there's a plethora of papers that are published that say, well, this could help practitioners monitor invasive species. But when you're actually looking at the methodology, looking at the way that they approach the question, it would actually be very difficult for it to be replicated by practitioners. You would have to have quite extensive remote sensing knowledge. A lot of these papers were using this very high resolution data that was really expensive. And there's a lot of great information out there, but it really wasn't reasonable, in my humble opinion, to say that this was easy for practitioners to replicate. So, we wanted to come together and figure out how we could work together for this mutual goal of trying to monitor invasive species and how we could make this effective for both of us and find sort of the synergies and highlight some of the differences, but really try and come up with ways that we can work together. And one of the things that I think a lot of the remote sensing researchers tend to do is use the highest resolution data possible to try and get over the need for field data. But without field data to really validate and calibrate your models, you're not really getting as accurate as you could be. So first of all, we did this literature review, and we really highlighted these synergies. So first, the literature suggests, most of the literature had suggestions for what remote sensing researchers needed to do better. And this starts with encouraging students early in their careers to work with practitioners, to talk about what practitioners are doing. This can be, classes in undergrad where students are working with practitioners on projects, having practitioners come in and talk to students. But the literature suggested that by the time, researchers got, for far enough in their careers, they really weren't prepared. They didn't really understand what practitioners were doing. And this, I think, really enabled that idea of, oh yeah, this will be so useful for practitioners, without really understanding that it's not that helpful the way it's laid out. Next is holding workshops and stakeholder meetings. It's not as common, I think, for us as researchers to have meetings like this, where we all get together, talk, where there is this community and knowledge sharing. So that's something that researchers really need to work on. And another thing is the way that we disseminate information. So as researchers, we are hyper focused on publishing papers, and specifically in peer-reviewed journals. But as practitioners, it's not necessarily in your job description to keep up with all of this literature. For me, I have such a narrow field that it makes sense that I would be reading all of the relevant literature and trying to keep up with it. But practitioners, their jobs tend to span, a variety of topics. So it's not very reasonable to expect them to keep up with all of this literature. And then there's always, the jargon and ways that scientific papers that are written that make it not as helpful as it really could be. So a lot of the literature actually suggested relaying our information either through technical manuals or through these workshops and stakeholder meetings, rather than just publishing them. And we also noticed quite a few logistical barriers. Some of this is going to be, a little bit of a repeat from the last slide, but some of it is sharing this data. Throughout this Catskills project, I think I accumulated like 2 terabytes of data. That's not easy to share. It's not easy to send this around to people. So that is its own barrier. Like I said before, that jargon, the different scales that we tend to work on. So, in remote sensing, I'm very focused on the scale of whatever satellite I'm using, whereas, practitioners are more focused on, these very, very large areas, rather than, this 30-meter cube. And mismatches in publishing. So again, where is this information going, and is it being relayed in the proper location for it to find the people that it needs to? And we took all of this, we thought about what we really wanted to come out of this project, and there were a couple things. We wanted this to actually be easy to replicate, and that meant using freely available data, which meant that we really rely on field data to help train and validate our models. So we created this conceptual framework to really show how this process works and how the field data that we get is invaluable to us. So we have the researcher side. This is really focused on remote sensing researchers specifically, and then practitioners that work with invasive species monitoring, management, and mitigation. So the first step in all of this is identifying some species of ecological concern. So identifying some invasive species, and recognizing that it is a threat. And really the first step, before us we can do anything on the remote sensing side. We really need data from practitioners on where these invasive species are through field surveys, and we need to know a good bit about the species biology, actually. And I'll go into some details about that next, using Hemlock Indelgid as an example. But if we are going to identify knowledge gaps and figure out what technologies we're going to use, so these first two steps, we have to know a good amount about this invasive species. If it's a pest, we need to know what it is infesting, what the host species is. If it is, like the cheatgrass example, we need to know when this cheatgrass is growing. We need to know when it's most active, when we're going to be most able to see it using remote sensing. So we need this information on life cycle spread and things like that before we can even get started. And then really the first thing we do once we've figured out what data we're going to use is we use field data to train our model. So we need, whatever field surveys have been conducted in order to start to train our model and make it more accurate. So then, we take that model training, we're going to calibrate our model a little bit more, we're going to do some validation. Both of this is going to require field data. And then, look at the accuracy, uncertainty. And once we have used all of this field data to train our models very well, to figure out how accurate they are, to do some validation of our models, we can finally have some sort of map, some sort of product that predicts the distribution of invasive species, which then can be used by practitioners to continue their field surveys and monitoring and management efforts. So that's really the last to the practitioner side. Continuing this work, continually collecting this field data, continuing this monitoring and management if possible. And the last step of all of this is peer review to add to the body of scientific literature. Now, this is definitely more focused on the researcher side, because that is our main work objective, is to publish these papers. But I think it's really important for us to keep practitioners involved in this process. So we need them in the beginning. We need this help to even start up our project. We need as much information about these species as we can find. And the people on the ground are going to be the best people to get that information from. We need this field data to start creating our models. And once we get to that point, we shouldn't just, okay, this is it, the project is over. The practitioners really should be involved in this writing process, at least to make sure that our claims are correct, that the way we are approaching the question is actually most helpful to them, especially if we're going to claim that in our papers, right? Like I said before, there's all these papers that say, oh, this will be helpful to practitioners. But in reality, if a practitioner actually, looked at it and, got to give their input, they'd probably say that it wasn't as useful as they thought it was. So this is really about collaboration from the beginning all the way through the end. Publishing this scientific paper isn't the end of it either. Researchers really should be, contributing to workshops, talking to practitioners, and continuing this collaboration, well beyond a map or a product is created, and really as long as this invasive species is still a concern. So I'm going to use Hemlock Indelgid to sort of walk through the first couple steps of this and show you how this field data is important, but also highlight some of the mismatches that we saw throughout our project and give some suggestions at the end. So Hemlock Indelgid is this little aphid that tends to, it's invasive from Asia. It was first introduced to the US in North Carolina around 1950, and it spread quite far across the East Coast. And this little aphid sits on the needles of the hemlock tree and slowly sucks the sap out of the tree, which can lead to pretty slow decline and eventual death. So it can take between 2 and 10 years for a tree to actually fully succumb to hemlock woolly adelgid. And they only infect, in our region at least, they only infect these eastern hemlock trees. And that is particularly concerning because hemlocks, eastern hemlocks, are a foundational species in our region. They are very important bird habitat, mammal habitat, and they also produce a very specific microclimate. So they have a very dense canopy that shades the ground below them, cooling it off, and they tend to be found around water bodies. And this cooling effect leads to cooling of rivers and streams, which creates favorable condition for things like trout. So losing these hemlock trees would be absolutely devastating to animals, across, fish, birds, mammals, all of it. Losing these hemlock trees would affect them. So in order for us to start monitoring hemlock woolly adelgid decline, we used the species biology that we had available to us. We talked to a lot of the practitioners who've been working with and monitoring these species for a very long time. And that helped inform us of how we were going to approach this problem. So first, because we know that hemlock woolly adelgid is only affecting these eastern hemlock trees, we used national land class data from 2016, and we targeted areas where forests were classified either as deciduous or mixed forest, because outside of that, we don't really care. We know that hemlock woolly adelgid is not going to be there. So that really narrowed down the area that we were looking at. Next, we wanted this to be easy to replicate. We wanted to be able to go back in time to around the 2000s, early 2000s, where we knew that this was sort of when the problem first started. So we knew we had to use Landsat in order to do that. And we collected images from 2000 through 2015. And we really focused in on the growing season because we know from the life cycle of hemlock woolly adelgid that they're adults around March through June. So that is when we're more likely going to see the most significant effect of these insects when they're adults and they're most active. And we used stands that had been previously assessed by Chris, the Catskill Research Group, and focused on healthy and declining stands. So first we have this healthy stand outlined in yellow from 2005 to 2015 using satellite imagery. And then the NDVI values are below. So in 2000, our high NDVI is 1, that's very healthy. -1 is very unhealthy vegetation, or things like roads, bare soil, rock, that is going to show up as a -1 in NDVI. So this healthy stand we can see over time. The NDVI is not changing all that much, except for some parts here. And when we look at the satellite imagery, we can see that that corresponds to a road being built in that area. So this points to a challenge of remote sensing, is that any sort of change to that land area, building roads, urbanization, all of that is going to affect our results. So if we hadn't looked at the satellite imagery and we just looked, at this NDVI, then it might have looked like there was, a mass of dying trees, but in reality, it's just a road that was constructed. But then in our declining stand, so again, satellite imagery from 2005 to 2015, in this 10-year period, we went from very intact forest to, in 2015, all of these little gray dots are dead hemlock trees. In 10 years, that's quite a significant amount of tree decline in one small area. And we could kind of see it in our NDVI imagery. So in 2000, everything's pretty green, some slow yellowing happening in 2005, but in 2015, we do have some areas where our NDVI's values are showing up in red, so they're pretty low. And if we look at the corresponding satellite imagery, we can see that these are areas where there's a pretty high cluster of dead trees. So, we use this data to help train our model. And, this is, preliminary work on the project, and I can update later on, but this is just really walking through, the first steps to beginning a project and how this field data can be useful. But there were some mismatches, and it wasn't, it was clear that there needed to be more communication on what was needed. In terms of field work. So the biggest mismatch that we found came with scale. So we used these stands that were assessed by Chris, in these yellow outlines. And to assess these stands, they assessed the health of between 50 and 60 random hemlock trees within the stand. So these stands ranged in size from 4 to 66 hectares. So quite large areas, a lot of variety in the size of these different stands. And they were assessing 50 to 60 trees out of thousands, right? So, the stand was in severe decline, but it could really just be part of the stand that was experiencing this stronger decline. And, when we were thinking about the data that we were using, so if we start, with our satellite imagery, we zoom into a specific area of this stand, and we can start to pick out individual dead trees just from the satellite images. But when we come down to our Landsat data, unless there's areas where there's a large cluster of dead trees, so this area here and over here, we really don't see that much change in NDVI because there's so much else happening around the tree. We have that mixed pixel effect, so the dead trees really aren't sticking out as much as they need to for the satellite to really pick them up. But then when we use Sentinel data with that 10-meter resolution, it's a lot better at picking up these decline signals. So, our NDVI values are actually getting very low into the zeros. But, over here where we just have one dead hemlock tree surrounded by healthy trees, it's really not picking up that decline. So the scale was an issue here. Another thing is the way that trees decline from Hemlock woolly Indelgid. So the more we learned about HWA, we learned that the aphid tends to start at the bottom of the tree and work its way up. So when we're using this satellite imagery, we're only seeing what's happening at the top of the canopy. So the tree could be basically dead at the bottom, and the sensor is just reading the live part of the tree from above. So that was obviously a problem. There's also regeneration. So yeah, I don't know what happened. My internet has never cut out like that before, but it just completely kicked me off. So I'll try and jump back in. All right. So then the other thing we found is that between groups, there were very different approaches in the field to monitoring things. One example is that one group was looking at the density of Hemlock woolly Indelgid eggs on trees, but only focusing on certain parts of the tree, whereas others were looking further and sampling more intensively. So between the two of them, we were getting very different field data. So there's definitely a need for more standardized field method approaches. And then finally, the biggest thing, and maybe one of the more striking things we ran into, is that our definitions of success were incredibly different, right? So even the way that I talked about this image, how we had these differences in, scale, the product that we ended up putting out with some tweaking of the model based on the field data. We gave it to a group that was monitoring Hemlock woolly Indelgid, and they used this map to try and find instances of Hemlock woolly Indelgid, and they came back with about a 1% success rate, which for us, we were like, wow, that's awful. We we really thought that there's obviously still more work to do, but there's no way we would have done anything with that data. But then talking to the practitioners that used it, they were like, no, that was actually helpful. They described looking for Hemlock woolly Indelgid as shooting darts in the dark. So having a map that was 1% accurate still at least gave them something to go off of. And I wonder how many projects like this are abandoned before they get calibrated and tweaked to a point where they're more useful, just because as researchers were like, oh wow, this is not good, we're not getting the type of data that we're really aiming for. I wonder how frequently things like that are abandoned before they have the opportunity to really grow and be helpful, just because our definitions of what is helpful are different. All right, so a lot of this points to field work and the need for more field data and targeted field data. So we took all of this, we thought about sort of what our wish list of field data would be as remote sensing researchers, and we talked to the practitioners and thought about what the difficulty of integrating these things were, and we came up with this figure. So there's a lot happening here. We have these different metrics, different field variables, how they can be collected, and some of the challenges in collecting them. So you'll see a lot of this is in red, right? Because it takes, high expertise, it's time consuming, there's expensive equipment that's required. But there are some things that are relatively straightforward and simple to measure that could be incredibly helpful. So I really want to focus on aspects of composition, particularly tree species composition, and the actual condition of trees. So some of this more useful field data would be species composition data. So like I mentioned in Landsat, with Landsat and Hemlock woolly Indelgid, we kept running into the problem of we've got, if we're in a mixed forest and we have one dying hemlock or two dying hemlocks, but 6 healthy, let's say, maple trees surrounding it, there's so much noise happening compared to what we're looking for, that we're not going to be able to pick up that decline. But if we had more specific species composition data, we would be able to sort of back measure that and say, okay, well, only this amount of the pixel is going to be represented, and sort of work out a more of a likelihood analysis that could be a little bit more useful than just looking at this NDVI and saying, oh, well, it's pretty healthy. Another thing is leaf area index. So this is just how much of the canopy is covered by leaves. There's difficult ways to measure this, and you can measure it with remote sensing, although it's a little more challenging. But there's a fairly simple field approach, and that is just taking hemispherical photos. So it does require a hemispherical lens, but if you take these pictures, there's free and actually very easy to use software that can give you this leaf area index and tell you how much of the canopy is actually leaf and how much light is going to be coming through the canopy. And that can help us, one, over time, measure gain or loss of leaves, but also like how much noise are we getting from the ground when we're measuring these things. And then, measures of vigor and health that sort of span more of the tree would be particularly useful, instead of just focusing on, the bottom of the tree. particularly for training purposes, if we have some sort of crown vigor measurement, then that's a lot more useful for us in training than what's happening at the bottom of the tree. And really the last big thing is this push for more involvement in community science. So we have a bunch of different apps here: Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities, Forest Tree Diagnosis. These two apps actually can walk you through the steps of assessing the health of trees and the checking for pests. And they're really geared not just towards scientists, not just towards ecologists, not just for practitioners, but really anybody interested. And because of that, that really, one, helps to standardize the way that we're collecting data, because we have these steps that you're following in the app, but it also opens up the potential for people to collect all of this data. And it also provides free field data. So IMAP invasives, we're looking at very specific instances of invasive species and where they're found. That's excellent field data that we can use for our models. iNaturalist as well. But it's really, having this data that is freely available, having standardized methodologies used to collect this data so that it's more comparable between users and whoever's collecting it. And the greatest thing about these apps is that they're developed for people across skill sets. You don't need a lot of background knowledge necessarily to start using these apps, to start collecting data, and to really be a participant in the scientific process. So key takeaways: these collaborations are, have great potential to be mutually beneficial as remote sensing researchers. If we want to create something that is useful for practitioners, that is easy to replicate, that can be, used to continuously monitor over time without using a lot of financial resources, we need field data. But for this to work, we really have to think about scale. We have to find a balance between what field methods are useful, appropriate, and actually feasible. Think about our definitions of success, and again, really think about using these cost-effective methods. The high resolution data is amazing, but these invasive species are not going to go away overnight. Or otherwise, we wouldn't have all of this effort into monitoring, managing, and mitigating them. So, this is sort of a marathon, not a sprint type of thing. So, our approach is really trying to make this sustainable for however long it takes us to, mitigate the impacts of these invasive species or get rid of these invasive species. And that's it. Yeah, I can go into some updates on the Hemlock stuff, but this is really it. Since I'm over time now.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. I found that so interesting, and I'm sure that people in our audience have questions. I feel like, as you mentioned, that so many of these invasive species have different things about scale and the needs that you have for a particular project. So I'd be interested also to hear from our audience if there is a remote sensing project that you have in mind, or particular questions that you have now that we are having this collaboration between researchers and practitioners. So any questions out there? Yes. Oh, and if you could speak to this little microphone, sorry.
Did you apply all the information from the remote sensing through like ArcGIS and stuff to create the map? Or did you use like a different program?
Did you hear the question?
Yeah. So we've used quite a few different programs and softwares. I started using one called TerraSet, which is not free. And then we started switching to like Google Earth Engine, which has like free coding. We've used quite a few different approaches actually to mapping these things. We started off with things that were not free, required a little bit more background information, and then really started to move into more freely available stuff.
So what was the one that you mentioned? I'm not familiar with that. The first one?
Tear set.
Care set?
Yeah.
How do you spell that?
TERRSET.
There you go. That's how I would have thought. Okay. Yeah, never heard of it. Any other questions? One thing I thought of, while maybe other people are thinking questions is, you're really busy as a researcher. We're really busy, in the field and torn in a million different directions. So do you have any thoughts on how you can make these collaborations fruitful, when they do happen? What are like those, I don't know, those key things, and what do you, maybe if you have thoughts on co-production, co-producing research?
I think a lot of the problem really stems more from the researcher side. I think from my experience, the practitioners are usually a lot more open to collaborating, and just like, in my experience, it was like, okay, what do you need from us? What would be helpful? It was very easy to have these discussions. And I think the big problem is really getting researchers to the table. And I think this is exactly it, right? Workshops like this, where I can come in and give a talk and, tell you what I'm working on, and that this is happening, and start to have these conversations, I think is really the biggest step. I think one of the easiest ways to get an academic to come and talk is to tell them to give a talk. Ask them to come give a speech and talk about what they're working on, and they're more than happy to do that. And that's, I think, where a lot of this collaboration starts. We really want to start holding workshops and things like that, though, really continue this and to get more people involved in it. But yeah, I think it's largely on the researchers to get it together.
Yeah. Yeah, so we try to hold meetings like this and reaching out to researchers, seeing what the latest things are, to strike that balance. Yeah, and to get those collaborations going. So thank you for being here also. So not seeing any other comments in the chat, or hands raised in the room. So I think that might be it from us. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll do another virtual round.
Thank you.
Okay, so and our final moments of this meeting. So last call for other business, other things that you thought of that you wanted to mention while we're still all here together. Anything else to mention? Also goes for you virtual people as well. No? I gave my other business already in the meantime, talking about the Marine ID cards that I thought of. So again, if you have any interest in those, let me know. And with that, our next partners meeting, we've scheduled for Friday, September 8th. So taking the field season off, enjoy. I'm sure there'll be much to report on when we come back in the fall. And you can reach all of us at once at invasive@LIISMA.org if you want to get the whole team. So, and so say thank you and have a great holiday weekend.